Out of all the Straw Hats, Usopp's journey is the most unique and the most human. Whereas every other Straw Hat's goal is an external, objective accomplishment, finding the One Piece, becoming the world's strongest swordsman, learning the true history, and so on, Usopp is the only Straw Hat whose journey is internal and subjective to his own feelings about himself. What does it mean to become a brave warrior of the sea? Is it something that can be measured, a title to be attained? By all accounts, most people would say that by virtue of overcoming so many battles and risking his life so many times, and making it so far through the New World, Usopp has already been a brave warrior of the sea for a long time now. But that's the beauty of Usopp's journey. It's not about what we, the reader, think. It's not about what the other characters in the world of One Piece think. Usopp's journey comes down to what he thinks of himself. Essentially, Usopp is on a journey to change his own perception of himself. And finally, we are at the end point of this journey that was marked out for us 1,000 chapters back. Elbaf is the island that Usopp felt from the beginning would be the measuring stick for himself as to whether or not he truly has become a brave warrior of the sea. And that means that something absolutely beautiful is going to happen in Elbaf. A piece of character writing that may be the best in all of One Piece. Because if Usopp went through fighting superhuman monsters with nothing but a slingshot and booze, and if Usopp put his life on the line just to defend his friend's dream, and if Usopp had to take on some of the strongest pirates of the Grand Line single-handed, and if Usopp declared war on the entire world, and if Usopp is already regaled as the legendary hero for an entire kingdom, and none of that has made Usopp himself feel like he is a brave warrior yet, then that means that what we are missing for Usopp is a piece of writing for his character that goes to something fundamentally far deeper than any of that. Something even more meaningful, something so profound and unprecedented that it would finally change his perception of himself. Whatever Oda has been saving for Usopp and Elbaf for so long is likely the single greatest character storyline in One Piece history, and the keys to understanding what this storyline likely looks like begins with the fact that Yassop, Usopp's father, is waiting on the island, the fact that there are two key setups related to the lore of Elbaf that tie directly to Usopp's character, the fact that Usopp's Haki development began in Dressrosa, and finally, the fact that Usopp's final greatest character shortcoming that he needs to overcome was actually already revealed to us in the Wano arc. But first, I want to ask, what if you could talk to One Piece characters? In fact, what if I told you right now you could actually speak to your favorite One Piece character? Or try to flirt with your favorite waifu? I want to show you an insanely cool new app to mess around with that is literally completely free. This is Haki. It's the sponsor for this video, and it's the premier AI app in existence for talking to any and all fictional characters. I'm genuinely having a lot of fun spending literal hours interacting with characters, whether it's messing with Zoro, telling him that I became the world's strongest swordsman already by defeating Mihawk.
You don't look like you could swing a sword around.
Well, I'm actually pretty good.
Fine. If you're so good, then show me what you got.
I can't. I'm sick today. Or trying to hit on Nami and see if she could fall for me.
Hey, newbie. Staring at me will cost you 2,000 berries. Just kidding.
How much for a happiness punch?
A happiness punch? I can give you a free one. Come here!
Or asking Luffy the question that every One Piece fan cares about, when do you think One Piece will end? It genuinely feels like I'm getting to interact with real One Piece characters. I even asked Law if he would admit that he and Kid never actually defeated Big Mom, the random TNT did. Do you admit that TNT defeated Big Mom, and that you and Kid got lucky? But if you want to hear his answer, you have to try it out for yourself. And this isn't even just limited to One Piece. I'm talking all anime, all manga, all TV show characters, all movie characters, comic book characters, hell, even real life figures. This AI can simulate anything. I can go to Naruto and tell him Obito isn't the coolest guy and see how he responds. And again, this is all completely free. You can just go there and mess around. You can download this as an app so you can have fun with it on your phone. So go now, click the link, or just explore the app for a second, and you can see a ridiculous number of options for characters from all media and people in real life. Just click on one, test out what it feels like having a conversation with a character. You will not be disappointed, and in fact, you'll probably get addicted real fast. So that aside, to begin with, even before the island of Elbaf was introduced into the story, you must understand that Usopp's character concept in the first place was always intrinsically tied to the concept of giants. The idea of a brave warrior wielding a slingshot most famously goes back to David, the hero who felled the giant Goliath. This has always been the starting point for Usopp's character. He's always been the simple, human underdog, wielding a humble slingshot, having to fell giants everywhere that he goes. Even before Elbaf was ever mentioned, Usopp's storyline from conception was likely always planned to lead up to an island wherein Usopp would finally literally be among giants and have to stand just as tall as any of them as an equal, even all the while still being a simple human with a simple slingshot. I don't necessarily mean Usopp will have to defeat a giant in Elbaf. It's possible, but more so I'm talking about the idea that Usopp, with his slingshot, can stand just as tall as any giant, seems to have been the point of planning Usopp's storyline to be tied to an island of giants from the start. Oda himself has talked about how Usopp is supposed to be the most relatable and human of the Straw Hats. So placing Usopp in a setting where everyone is a superhuman giant and Usopp himself is the only ordinary man, that feels like a perfectly planned ending point for his personal character journey. But beyond David and Goliath, another important lore reference already set up in Elbaf is the giant prince Loki. As everyone knows, in Norse mythology, Loki is a god who is not a traditional macho Viking warrior, but rather a god who relies on trickery and mischief, which is interestingly similar to Usopp. This makes me feel that a pivotal theme that may be dissected in Elbaf is what it means to be a brave warrior, because if you remember, a large part of the point of Little Garden was that it was shameful that Mr. 3 relied on cunning and trickery to win a fight against the giants, who fought so honorably and directly. And yet this cunning, trickery-based combat is also how Usopp fights, despite Usopp aspiring to be as brave as the giants. The reality is that no matter how brave Usopp aims to be, no matter how much he wishes to emulate the spirit of the giants, he physically can't fight like them. He will always have to fight in his own style of trickery and cunning. Could it be possible that Loki of Elbaf may end up being a kindred spirit to Usopp? Someone who also wishes to emulate the bravery that he sees around him, but is not able to fight in the manner that everyone else fights. Having Usopp connect with a character who is an outlier among the Elbaf giants may have significant potential for exploring the idea of bravery in general, and what it means to be brave even if one cannot fight with the same direct means that other stereotypically brave warriors can. Interestingly, there's also a very different angle that will likely be explored when it comes to the question of what it means to be a brave warrior, which is through Usopp's father, Yassop. Yassop and the red-haired pirates are clearly going to be pivotal characters in the Elbaf arc. And remember, even though the giants of Elbaf have been Usopp's recent idols of brave warriors of the sea, the original brave warrior of the sea that Usopp fantasized about following in the footsteps of was his father, Yassop. The fact that all of Usopp's idols of brave warriors that he's been chasing are being written into the very same arc means that the upcoming storyline was likely planned from the initial conception of Usopp's character. Which makes sense because, interestingly, if we trace back the roots of why Usopp is who he is today, a lot of his core issues likely stem from his father. We know that Usopp is proud of his father, we know that Usopp admires him for having risked his life to take to the seas and become a pirate. And yet, isn't there something really important here that Usopp often chooses not to think about? The fact that Yassop, in choosing to be a brave warrior of the sea, abandoned Usopp and his mother. See, a lot of Usopp's unhealthy character traits, such as his obsession with lying, began because Usopp's mother was dying, and Usopp's father, who abandoned them, certainly wasn't returning anytime soon. Usopp's final words to his mother were lies about how his father would one day return. This has to have been a deeply painful memory for Usopp. As much as Usopp admires his father for being a stereotypical brave warrior of the sea, is there not something twisted about the fact that Yassop chose this pursuit over his wife and child? And the fact that Usopp has developed this obsession with being a brave warrior of the sea to emulate his idealized, rose-tinted vision of his dad, while simultaneously ignoring the pain that his father caused him, is a classic case of a child idealizing a form of masculinity that would be considered highly unhealthy. So some pieces are beginning to click into place here. Usopp has objectively been acting as a brave warrior of the sea for so long by anybody else's standards, and yet he himself never seems to believe that he is one. Could we be approaching a storyline where we get to actually examine the meaning of being a brave warrior of the sea and how Usopp may have actually had it all wrong in his head to begin with? After all, the fact that Usopp relies on tricks and cunning to win fights, unlike the honorable giants of Elbaf, that is something that has to be reckoned with soon. The potential of connecting with a character like Loki, who may be a bit of a misfit among the giants as a similarly non-traditional warrior, may also hold great importance there in terms of examining what it means to be brave. And most importantly, Usopp finally reuniting with his father, the man that first imprinted upon Usopp this obsession with becoming a brave warrior, along with every other unhealthy trait that Usopp has, his incessant lying, his poor self-image, maybe even the fears of abandonment that we saw surface in the Water 7 arc, all of that will likely come to a head as well. As such, I believe it's very likely that Oda has a deeper examination planned as to the meaning of being a brave warrior, as well as some introspection for Usopp and his dream, maybe even reframing his understanding of what it means to be a brave warrior. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Setting that aside, looking at Usopp in the post-time skip, there are two key pieces of character writing setup that have been planted for him that are likely set to pay off in Elbaf. First, Usopp's development in Haki, and second, Usopp's fear of death. The Dressrosa arc was the last heavily Usopp-centric arc, with Usopp arguably being the third major protagonist of the arc along with Luffy and Law. In this arc, Usopp took huge steps forward, as this was the first arc where Usopp acted as a hero for a large group of characters who he had no personal connection to. And it's also the first arc where we saw Usopp set aside his desire for glory and his need to exaggerate his accomplishments with a much more humble acceptance of his true role on the crew as the quiet, unseen sniper in the background. These personal strides rewarded Usopp with a Haki bloom, observation Haki specifically. This is absolutely huge, as it made Usopp actually the third Straw Hat ever to have a Haki bloom in battle. And so far, Usopp has yet to have any further development at all in this area, meaning that this is a lingering point of development. That's perfect, as that gives us a lot of room for something exciting to develop in Elbaf. Oda has likely been waiting to progress Usopp's Haki development to go hand in hand with Usopp's next bout of character development. And the fact that Oda has saved Usopp's most significant character development ever for Elbaf makes me believe that we may see a huge step forward in Usopp's Haki here. Maybe he gets Future Sight, or maybe, just maybe, even Conqueror's Haki. After all, in all of One Piece, the three characters that Oda most frequently likes to write extremely powerful displays of transcendent willpower for are Luffy, Zoro, and Usopp. It's easy to forget because Usopp's lows as a character are very low, but Usopp's highs are just spectacular, iconic, larger-than-life displays of will, spirit, and resolve. I believe there is a reason that Usopp is a character that Oda goes back to for these types of moments again and again, because the point is that having Conqueror's Haki isn't just about strength. Rather, there's a fundamental type of character writing that is associated with Conqueror's Haki. And while Usopp would certainly be the most cowardly Conqueror's Haki user ever, that strangely isn't contradictory for him, as Usopp's moment of resolve are all the more grand precisely because Usopp perseveres and stands his ground through such intense fear. It's also interesting that having Conqueror's Haki was one of Usopp's many lies, as Usopp's lies do often have a tendency to one day come true. There's also one significant way in which Usopp is written fundamentally differently from the rest of the Straw Hats that is tied to this as well, but you can get my extended thoughts on that in my weekly podcast by supporting me on Patreon, link in the description below. But regardless, whether it's Conqueror's Haki or just more observation Haki, Usopp having some major growth in Haki in Elbaf is almost guaranteed. The bigger question is, what scenario would cause Usopp's Haki to bloom? And this is where we come to the fundamental internal conflict that was set up for Usopp back in Wano. The fear of death. Wano was Usopp's most cowardly arc ever by far. From the very beginning, where Usopp bragged about how he would sell out his friends right away if he was captured, to talking about how death isn't worth supporting your friend's dreams, to proudly telling the samurai how he runs away from death at every opportunity, to basically being a sniveling wreck during the entire Onigashima finale while everyone else around him was being brave. Wano just wasn't a good look for Usopp. See, while it's not uncommon for Usopp to say a lot of cowardly things in an arc, usually if Usopp's being extra cowardly in an arc, it's actually a setup for him to have an extremely brave moment of redemption and growth in that same arc. But Wano is the first arc where Usopp laid on the cowardice extremely thick from start to finish, and then had no redeeming moments or moments of growth by the end of the arc. While I don't think that's good for the Wano arc, in the long term that works if it's setting up in advance what Usopp needs to overcome in Elbaf. Even though throughout the story Usopp has put his life on the line many times, it seems as though it was important to establish in the Wano arc that, despite having risked his life in the past, there is still room for Usopp to grow in fully overcoming his fear of death. Now at this point, I cannot give a definitive guess as to how Oda could possibly demonstrate Usopp overcoming a fear of death in a new way that is somehow more conclusive than everything Usopp has already done. But one idea I have voiced before and broken down in depth in a past video is the possibility of Usopp sacrificing himself and actually dying a hero. After all, just as far back as Usopp's dream of becoming a brave warrior like the giants of Elbaf goes, so too was that accompanied with Usopp explaining that his hypothetical moment of self-fulfillment would be being able to proudly die in a manner befitting a brave warrior of the sea. In Usopp's mind, that sort of death would be the one where he could truly feel that he has finally achieved his dream of being a brave warrior. Now that's really, really interesting, because this fantasy directly conflicts with Usopp's most recent low point of how he avoids a proud warrior's death at all costs. So setting up Usopp's big character flaw being intense fear of death shortly before the long-awaited Elbaf arc where Usopp's character journey seems set to complete, with the completion of Usopp's character journey in the first place having been framed around Usopp wanting to be able to proudly die as a brave warrior is, well, it seems more than coincidental. There's a lot more detail in this video if you want to click it, but I also want to be clear here that I'm not necessarily saying Usopp will die in Elbaf. I feel like if Usopp dying is even remotely possible in the story, it would happen later on, unless Elbaf turns out to be a much bigger arc than we expected and the Blackbeard pirates are also involved. It just feels way too early for even the possibility of Usopp dying. However, what I am saying is that at the very least the character development of Usopp conquering his fear of death in some way makes sense for the Elbaf arc. As just one arc prior, this was the sorry picture that Usopp was painting, which is a far cry from the standards of the Giants of Elbaf that Usopp dreamed of being able to reach. As such, the Elbaf arc will likely involve bridging the gap for Usopp's character between this to this. Although that doesn't necessarily mean Usopp having to actually die. And if Usopp is able to take this next step in terms of bravery, overcoming his fear of death, it would likely be the greatest character moment for Usopp ever. One wherein Usopp would finally feel like he's a brave warrior of the sea, thereby completing his internal journey of shedding his perception of himself as a coward. I also believe that this type of moment, conquering his fear of death, however that may happen, will be the one where we get to see Usopp's next Haki bloom, similar to what happened in Dressrosa, but simply on a much more dramatic level. Again, in this case, Conqueror's Haki certainly wouldn't be out of the question, considering Conqueror's Haki blooms can often be in the face of death. And even Zoro just unlocked Conqueror's Haki specifically by recklessly giving in to killing himself with Enma for the sake of winning the battle. However, if Usopp instead blooms further in observation or even armament, that would be great as well, of course. So ultimately, what is the story that is shaping up for Usopp in Elbaf? Well, it's likely one that first examines what it means to be a brave warrior of the sea and Usopp's own motivation to become one, with figures such as Loki and Usopp's father Yassop likely playing a pivotal role. Second, whatever development Usopp makes in this arc will likely be accompanied by some substantial step forward in Haki for him, either furthering his observation Haki or even unlocking Conqueror's Haki. And finally, whatever Usopp's core character conflict is this arc, it will likely involve him overcoming his deep-seated fear of death that was set up in Wano, thereby fulfilling Usopp's desire that was set up all the way back in Little Garden to be able to face death bravely as a warrior of the sea. We have all the ingredients here for a masterful character arc for Usopp, and really it has to be his greatest character arc ever, as all of his previous big moments of character development were factually not enough for him to feel that he had completed his internal journey. And considering how iconic so many of Usopp's past moments of character development have been, if what we are about to get in Elbaf will top even those, well then we are likely getting one of, if not the best pieces of character writing ever in One Piece. So let me know how you think Usopp's character storyline will play out in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, then definitely like and subscribe. And if you want to hear the fundamental way in which Usopp is written differently from the rest of the Straw Hats, you can get my extended thoughts on that in my weekly podcast by supporting me on Patreon. Link in the description below.